Hello, it's Harry Brook here for Flagstaff County, and today we're talking to Maryse Bourgault, who is the WGRF Research Chair in Integrated Agronomy at the University of Saskatchewan, as well as being an assistant professor. And today we're going to be talking about stress effects on crops, in particular cereals and pulses.
You're listening to the official podcast of Flagstaff County.
So, Maryse, could you tell us a little bit about, well, after last year's drought, people I think are more concerned about how to maintain productivity under dry conditions, which is stressful.
Yes, well, good day, Harry, and thanks for having me on your program. It's a pleasure to be here. And yes, indeed, after last year, I think we've all seen with our own eyes what water stress actually does to plants. And then because water is so important for everything, really. I mean, it's important, for
without it, you've got nothing.
Exactly. Yeah. You have no growth, you have no structure. So that's, how we see leaves wilting and not being able, and we don't have that energy transfer to seeds, which is really in agriculture what we're trying to get, right? So we're trying to get that harvestable yield. So when things get too dry, then obviously, if everything kind of breaks down.
So I have probably read sometime that peas are supposed to be one of the more water use efficient crops we have, as far as, inches of moisture available per bushel of yield. Is that true?
It may be true, and I think it's not necessarily because of the genetics of peas, but rather because they tend to be earlier maturing. So if you have something that's a little bit, that grows, and we tend to plant them earlier as well because they do tolerate that frost, and so they end up having a little bit less of that stress, that heat stress that wheat and canola and plants that we plant later might actually experience. But really, when you think about it, the more water use efficient crops tend to be C4 crops. So we're talking about sorghum, we're talking about corn, amaranth is one of the C4 crops as well, but these tend also to need more heat. And so we end up in the prairies with the problem that they tend to be longer season as well. So if we plant them late, it's a little bit of a risk whether or not they're actually whether or not we get to enough growing degree days for them to actually mature and for us to get that yield. But so if you're just looking at inches of rain though, and how much biomass you get out of it, C4 crops tend to be more productive in that sense.
So would that also apply for corn, say in southern Manitoba?
Yeah, it would. It's just because the way the C4 crops work is that they tend to concentrate that CO2 into different cells. So they don't need to have their stomate open as often. So they don't need to transpire as much to get as much of that photosynthesis and that CO2 in. So that's how they tend to be more water use efficient in that sense, because they can sort of do that. They can be more efficient with the water that they get. But as I said, it does take more heat for it. So and that's partly why we have them more in forages. But C4 forages are actually really really interesting for beef producers because of that.
Now you've got me thinking about forages.
Yeah, sorry about that.
I was just thinking how German millet's been used for a number of years as a C4 plant, but seeded fairly late to try and get some fall forage or even swath grazing with high quality, and also because of the waxy leaves, right?
Right.
So, but we'll stick with cereals at the moment since the big bucks right now are with the cropping. So what exactly, like under hot conditions and dry conditions when there's moisture stress, like most of our field crops are all C3s, which maybe you could just sort of explain the difference between C3 and C4 crops, if you would.
Yeah, so if we want to go into details a little bit more, it's the inside the leaf, inside the cells of the leaf. They're different, what we call photosynthetic pathways.
Right.
So all of them will take CO2 out of the atmosphere, and they, with light and water, they end up doing glucose or sugars inside the leaves, and then those sugars are used in various different parts.
The fuel to run the place. Yeah.
Yes, it's fuel for maintenance, but also for growth. So to produce new leaves, produce new organs, and produce grains as well. So all of the starch that ultimately everything comes from the sun, the energy of the sun and the CO2 that there's there. So all plants do that. C4, they have this additional structure. There's this additional pathway where some of that CO2 is being taken, but it's also being transformed into, it's called C4 because it's a 4-carbon compound. Yeah. And then that compound gets fed into special cells. And then the C3, the normal photosynthesis actually happens. But because they do that, it means that plants can actually shut down a little bit, so they don't have to transpire as much, because they don't have to have that much of that gas exchange to pick up the CO2, because part of it is being fed into. And that's important because in normal plants, in C3 plants, sometimes the enzyme that's responsible for taking CO2 also mistakes oxygen. So because oxygen is just O2, so there's just one little molecule that's different. So when that happens, then you get some of that light and some of that energy that's kind of being used for nothing, basically. So C4s don't have to do that. So C4 have evolved that mechanism to prevent something like that from happening.
And the, I guess, peak performance of each plant is different depending on the temperatures, right?
So C3, wheat, peas, lentils, etc., they tend to be cooler season and do better under cooler conditions. And that's partly why.
What's the temperature range that would I guess you'd say maximum efficiency?
I want to say I have a textbook answer for you somewhere, but top of my head, I would say 2025 is probably the better range of our wheat, peas, and might be a bit high for peas, but and whereas for corn you're kind of looking at 26 to 32 degrees is they will do well if they have enough water in that range. So
I've noticed when you have a cold summer, the guys that are growing forage corn, usually it's pitiful looking, and it becomes very expensive on a per ton basis. That's true, for sure. Okay. So with wheat, under drought conditions, when it's stressed, it tends to try and restrict stomata openings, right? To eliminate, or not eliminate, but certainly minimize the amount of moisture being lost through the leaves.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And sometimes we'll see leaves kind of curl a little bit as well, so they don't have that much light coming into them. So it's it's a little bit of a protection against that heat from the sun. Yeah. Yes. So we see that too, and I've seen that in beans as well. Sometimes you'll see the trifoliate will kind of curl into itself, and so that's
it's the same thing that happens with a lot of the tree leaves in Australia, where they're perpendicular to the actual sun.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Cool. So is there any work going on right now where they're trying to improve the drought ability of wheat and even peas?
Yes, and that's not a new thing, where people kind of say, with climate change, we need to look at this, but the truth is that we've been doing that for decades, and I've worked about 9 years in Australia, and I've worked in that space as well, because that's also it's an ever-present question, right? It's ever evolving. It's something that we have to deal with all the time. So I've worked in a group that we called it physiological breeding. So it's sort of before breeding, trying to understand what kind of traits might actually make some of these crops better able or better adapted. I don't really like to say drought tolerant because nothing that's living is tolerant to no water. At some point
more
you die.
water use efficiency, maybe.
Yes. So we want to, and just being adapted to having less water, or being able to deal with more of that water stress, or that water stress in more often, sort of thing. So trying to understand those traits is something that's been happening quite a bit in Australia, but we also do it here. Although, as you know, breeders are quite busy. They also have hundreds, if not thousands, of different lines grown in the field. So it's very difficult for them to actually look at all sorts of different things. So mostly, they'll
disease
look at yield.
packages.
Yeah, exactly. So disease packages, insects tolerance. But so the more information we can give breeders about, what kind of traits might be useful under drought conditions. And I'll do a parenthesis here to say that drought. Every drought is not the same drought. So drought
depends
is very
on timing,
complex.
right?
Exactly, right. So we might have one trait that works if you have dry conditions earlier in the season or earlier in the crop development. We might have some traits that are very specific if the stress happens at flowering, and so perhaps we want to have pollen that germinates as well, even if there is less, and that's very specific to that to that stage of the crop. And then we might also have, if we have a terminal drought, so something like we had last season, that it stops, raining a little bit before flowering, and then, you're going into that gradual drier and drier conditions. So all of these might actually need different traits for them as well. So trying to understand all of this it's a great challenge. I love it.
Oh, yeah. Well,
so I'm quite happy to work in that space.
I'm sure that you'll never run out of work to do. That's for sure.
No, exactly.
Because it is such a complicated mechanism, because it affects the entire plant, right? It shuts down the leaves. It's basically the whole point of an annual plant is to create progeny, and it will do whatever it has to provide something.
Yes,
sorry.
Go ahead, Harry.
Well, just that brought to mind kind of an old rule of thumb. I don't know how accurate it was, but in the brown soil zones and dark brown soil zones where moisture is almost always deficient. Some of the advice we used to give guys was actually reducing the plants per square foot and the seeding rate. With the whole, I guess the philosophy was, okay, if you only seed 18 plants per square feet or 180 plants per square meter, then moisture is going to be short, but it should be enough there to at least get some kind of a crop, as opposed to, like Brian Barris is now doing some work with some very high levels of seeding rates. And I was thinking, well, what happens if you use up all the water to germinate, and then you get the jointing, and all of a sudden it runs out?
Yes, and I have a story for you about this, Harry, because in my time in Australia, this was something that people were saying as well. And they have, especially with sorghum, they have these double skip rows. So you have two rows of sorghum, and then you would skip two, and then you would have another two rows of sorghum. And that was based on that principle that if you have more of that water that in the middle, the roots of the sorghum could go in between, and partly because you don't have a lot of that evaporation happening. Like once it's dry, the surface is dry, then you're not losing anymore.
Yeah.
And I was very skeptical. I was very skeptical of this because I felt that having a canopy, closing your canopy as early as possible means that all of that water doesn't evaporate.
Right.
And if it doesn't evaporate, it's used by the plant. But this year, we were doing an intercropping study with faba beans and different pulses and cereals and flax and canola and we had oats and fabas in one intercrop. And of course, we had the oats by themselves and the faba beans by themselves. And what we found was that the oats on 8 inches spacing or 20 centimeter spacing, we had like a pitiful yield out of it. They just, they just kind of dried out like really early.
They didn't canopy. Yeah.
They did a canopy, but I think, as you said, I think they ran out of water quick, and then there just wasn't enough to actually produce grain out of them. Whereas in the faba bean oat intercrops, the fabas couldn't compete, so the fabas completely died and shriveled. and the oats on, and what I think about it is then you get oats on 16 inches all of a sudden. And they did so much better. They did almost 400% more yield. It's I think we had 1.2 tons, so nothing extraordinary, but
it's certainly better than nothing.
Exactly. Yeah. So but compared to 300 kilograms, then so it was quite a bit of a difference. And so I wasn't convinced, and now I'm eating my words about it. So I do think that in very dry years, then maybe yes, we might need to revisit those planting densities. And
I think what you're telling me then is there is no rule of thumb, because there's always exceptions to the rules.
There is, and it's a bit hard because we never know in advance what the season is going to be like, isn't it? So
it's always 20/20 hindsight.
Yeah. Exactly.
Oh yeah, I know what I should have done. Interesting. Has there been much work done on varietal differences as far as tolerance to drought, or is it just sort of small incremental stuff? Because I'm wondering if there's, you say Thatcher wheat, which is an old wheat. Are our varieties now more drought tolerant than they were back then?
Yes. Well, when I was talking about that physiological breeding and trying to understand that's often what we do. So we'll take a range of different cultivars, and then we'll try and put them under stress or put them under a different condition. Part of two of my postdocs were looking at elevated CO2 and whether or not there were differences in how much they would respond to that.
Oh, yeah.
But being in Australia, drought was part of it as well, right?
Totally.
So trying to figure this out, so to give you examples of some of the traits that we found, there's been more work in cereals, obviously, just because they've been bred for longer, and we do have that historical, those historical varieties sometimes that we can go back to. And so in wheat, for example, we found that some cultivars tend to accumulate sugars in their stems before flowering or around flowering. In the mechanism for it, it's useful because when you get into those progressive terminal droughts, the plant doesn't have to make, it's got some sugars. Yeah. So it doesn't have to transpire and get some of that gas in because it's already got some of those sugars. So
I'll just use the bank account. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's saving. It's exactly right. It's saving some of those sugars in case it's a bit of an insurance, right? So in case it runs into problems, then it's got that fund that it can draw from. So that's one. We've also seen, differences in how much plants do transpire and how much of that, how much of that exchange is happening. So we do have some cultivars that tend to be that have a better transpiration efficiency. So that's very much related to that water use efficiency that you were talking about. Yeah. So there are small differences there as well, where we're finding some cultivars are just better efficient. So the idea is that at some point you want to stack them all, right?
So it's a case of many small hammers, not one big sledgehammer, but little ones. And exactly. It all adds towards better water use efficiency and production, despite the environment.
That's correct. And that's why, it's really hard to come up with like a genetically modified drought tolerant, because it's all these little adjustments that might be working together to make something that's more, more drought tolerant in parentheses, because we're more better adapted, something that's better adapted to.
It's kind of like the difference between quantitative and qualitative resistance, right?
Yes, it's very
many little
so.
Factors versus one single thing, and it's rare that we do actually get that one thing.
Yes.
So is there also, I know this is a little bit not off topic, but it's also another weather related question. is there also work done on sort of like frost tolerance?
There is a little bit on frost tolerance. There isn't as much, I don't think, because I think that's kind of, very Western Canadian kind of.
Well, frost any month of the year, right?
I know, right? But to be fair, there's a lot of some of those traits are really associated with different kinds of stresses as well.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to deal with, we call about, the free radicals, the oxidants.
Right.
So having all of the antioxidants, and, it seems like it might even be, not just plants, but for us as well. So being able to be able to gather some of those free radicals and prevent the damage that they do is something that's useful for drought. It's useful for heat. It's probably useful for frost. It's useful for all these different stresses as well.
The Swiss Army knife, yeah.
Yes, exactly. So there's some of that work
Okay.
that's also happening. There's a lot of work in a lot of things. The thing is, I think there's so much work in that's happening everywhere. I think part of our challenge is to be able to know all this and be able to make those links and put it all together into something that
To integrate it, yeah.
Yes, and that that we can bring forward basically.
And that's got to be the biggest challenge.
Yes, and we haven't even talked about roots yet, right?
Yeah, right. Sorry, let's talk about roots.
No, but yeah, so roots, we do believe are probably that next frontier into breaking that yield barrier, or having that transformative, if you want, step into greater yields, mostly because roots are so difficult to work with. They're so difficult to see. And we know so little about them that.
Well, and especially when they're complex with also things like the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi.
Yes.
Wheat communicates somewhat with it. Canola doesn't.
Yes.
So it's looks to me like there's enough work to keep you going until you're the age of 1,000 or so.
I would think so.
Yeah. Well,
I think so.
Well, it's interesting to hear what's going on, and I look forward to seeing what the new information comes out. But it's kind of like building a pyramid a block at a time, right?
Yes.
You've got to build on the foundation below you, and you keep going up.
Yes, and I think sometimes you realize that the foundation is not so good either. So you have to start over again. So that happens as well. So when we, there's things that we think we know, and then it turns out that maybe that's not completely right. So you have to go back to the drawing board and figure out what's happening.
I got a question for you. This is one thing I've been thinking about, right? Because like zero tillage is key to us conserving the moisture we have in our soils.
Yes.
So what happens when we lose glyphosate? Because that does concern me that, you've seen it in other parts of the world where you get weed resistance. I know this is not your actual specialty, but it makes me wonder, how can we maintain the current farming system that's predicated on this one chemical if we lose it? Because then, what's the alternative? Going back to tillage again. And I guess that really comes into the whole integrated pest management, integrated farming, where you're cognizant of all the various factors and try to do the best job you can. Because it seems to me that best we're going to be able to do is just to slow down the resistance.
Yes, and it is something I've been thinking about, and I've been wondering about that as well. And as you say, weed science is not my expertise, but I'm, now working with integrated agronomy and trying to, have those multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary projects. It is something that I'm thinking about, and also because I'm also interested in the bigger picture, and we do see that there isn't, new chemistry coming out. We it seems like we've tapped out the number of action groups and mode of actions that we have, and there's so many ways that we can kill plants without killing other things around them, and so yes, we end up with something that's static, a chemical that never changes, against biological populations that are able to evolve some of that resistance. So I think, maybe, and glyphosate is something that, because of the consumer perception of it, we might actually lose earlier
than that, yeah.
Then the resistance is forcing us to, but eventually, if you're looking at, 50, 100 years, in that kind of time frame for sustainability, then it's possible that at some point, chemicals are just not going to work anymore. So there is some work that's being done on those like non-tillage, because as you say, that soil disturbance is something that hasn't really worked too much for us in Western Canada, because we do need it. We do need the residues, we need it.
Soil conservation is based on glyphosate.
Yes, very much so. So we don't want to go back to tillage, but then the question is, how do you control your weeds? Precision ag is not going to solve every problem, but I do like, these new technologies where you can actually just spray where the weed is without having to spray everything. And that's going to help I think that's going to help a lot.
The green on green,
as well. Yes, exactly. So we can extend that lifestyle, that lifetime. And I should say, I know glyphosate is everyone's best friend, and I know we're using it quite a bit at Kernan as well, because it's immediate. There's no recropping intervals to worry about, and we never really know from year to year where we're going to be. So for sure, we use it a lot, but there's other chemistries out there as well that we need to be using, and that we should be using to make sure that we don't have that so much of that resistance. And I don't consider myself old, Harry.
No, I didn't say anything.
I'm not going to tell you exactly how old I am, but I was going through my undergraduates in the early 2000s.
Not recently.
But that recently, that gene flow and that resistance was something that was a theoretical problem. It wasn't, and yet it was already happening. We just didn't know about it, when I was doing my undergrad. So the speed at which resistance has happened, I think is
alarming.
Problematic.
Yeah,
it's just problematic. So there's futuristic kind of things about robots going into the fields, and
I always thought,
microwaves.
We got plants already out there that are allelopathic, right?
Yes.
And there's always that possibility, I guess, of trying to incorporate it into a wheat plant. Mind you, if you do that, you're always going to be taken away from yield potential, because the energy's got to come from the plant. But it seems for every solution, we usually develop a couple of problems.
Yes. And it could be as well that, maybe not having allelopathic plants, but having more plants. So one of the projects that we're starting this year is actually looking at cover crops in canola and wheat. And we are, I'm very conscious, and a lot of people kind of go, but if you do get a very dry year, what's, how much water is that going to take away from your cash crop? So, but there's anecdotal evidence from some farmers that, make these work. So it's a question maybe of finding out exactly how we can make this work, maybe, and see, and whether or not you consider the cover crops themselves to be weed, or hopefully, they can bring in some of that nitrogen back into the system as well, so that, we can
there's trade-offs, right?
Yes. And if you get more pollinators as well, because you have different kind of flowers, then maybe that helps as well. And we're a bit worried about pollinators, especially with canola, because we do see that it does make a difference. So,
and we have some problems with our pollinators, like the honeybees, right? Too many disease challenges.
Yes.
And insect pests themselves.
Yeah, and part of it is because they only have, more limited sources of feed. So if we give them a, slightly more diverse diet, they might actually do that.
Well, that brought to mind something that I saw a few years ago, and it was down at Oyen, which is kind of in our brown soil zone. And they had a bunch of plots, and they had put in various plots for cereals and stuff. And then they had that one plot that really stood out because it was actually a cover crop, or it was a multi-species crop. And I'm wondering why it was green when everything else was brown. And is it possible just because the various plants will prefer to take moisture from different levels?
It's possible, but really it's a big mystery, Harry.
Okay.
Because we don't really know all the time what's happening, even though you do see a lot more biomass and they have just the same amount of water as everything else. So I don't know, it could be, that they covered the surface a bit earlier so that there wasn't as much evaporation. It could be that they are taking water from different layers. It could be that because you have such a diversity of plants, that maybe you get, different plants having different, maybe feeding the mycorrhiza or the soil biota in the soil in a different way that kind of helps with that productivity as well. And so it's an exciting area of research.
Well, it's actually, agronomy is it's an exciting time to be out there being part of the research. I kind of wish I was.
The sun.
Yeah. I just wish I was younger. I could be involved in that sort of stuff.
Do it all over again.
Oh, yeah. Why not?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Well, at the moment, I can't think of any other questions to ask. I've got lots of questions. Just most of them are usually just leads to more questions.
Yes, indeed.
I thank you so much for your time, Maryse. It's been a real pleasure. And good luck as you search for answers. And I got a feeling, we need to take a more holistic approach to the whole farming. And sometimes I think our focus tends to get a little narrow because as producers, they focus on yield. Because if you don't keep the banker happy, you're not going to be happy.
Yes. Yeah, no, for sure. And I completely agree with you. And that's my vision for the chair as well, so that we can work with producers as well, so that we don't only do the microplots, university studies kind of thing. And of course, we need some of those for students to be able to graduate, do stats, etc. But my vision for the WGRF chair is to actually make those connections with producers and start to look at some of those issues and not only look at yield, as you mentioned, and not only look at the environmental impact, but also look at, how much labor does that take? And does that help your quality of life, or does that add, can we find ways of getting more of the synergies and less of the trade-offs into these kind of things? And that, of course, it does take time, and it does take collaborations with people with different disciplines. And of course, I envision, some of those early experiments on farm where we might have, strips of two different things. And if something comes up, perhaps, with the pollinators or with diseases or something like that, where I can call up on one of my colleagues and say, would you come out? Or, what are your thoughts about this? This is what's happening. Can we do something about this? And try to get, some of that documented and perhaps, we might want to talk again, Harry, at some point and talk about some of those experiences from people and how they've been able to make some of those best practices work for them.
That's always the challenge, to take it from the research out into the field where it can become an adopted practice. And it's been the challenge for as long as there's ever been extension. And it's ultimately, it seems to me that it has to be led, either finances and financial aspects have to be taken into account. Actually, when it comes down to trees, I wish we'd leave them in the field.
Yes.
But unfortunately, unless the provincial or federal government starts to credit producers for leaving them there, I don't see the current patterns of use changing.
Right. Yeah. It's probably one of the easiest thing to measure and say, yes, that we're going to keep them for 100 years.
Oh, yeah.
It's probably one of the easiest carbon credit that we could probably get. Even there's a lot of potential to increase carbon sequestration in
Oh,
soils.
totally.
But there's a lot of unknowns as well about how much we can actually keep in the ground, like how much of that is just going to be eaten by microbes.
It'll be cycled through, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. In which case it's not permanent, and then people don't want to pay for carbon that's not sequestered permanently into soils.
But if you remove it, you're certainly adding to the
yes.
emissions.
But with a tree, you can just measure the trunk, and you have a pretty good measure of that carbon. So
Didn't the U of S just put out a carbon assessment tool for tree areas? I think it was
That's
just
possible.
put in. It's a big
I
university.
know Colin Labrock has an app about it where
Yeah, that's the one I was
you can
thinking of because
enter
they
it.
just
Yeah.
mentioned it in the Western Producer.
Right. I'm sorry, I forget the name of it, but
I can't remember it either. I just read it yesterday. Anyways,
so perhaps you can have a link in the description or something like that. I can try and
Yeah.
find it for you and send it out.
okay. Well, thank you very much, Marissa. Once again, it's been a pleasure. And hopefully we can talk again.
Yes,
I don't think we've plumbed the depths or breadth of the whole subject, that's for sure.
there's plenty to talk more, absolutely.
You
But
bet.
thank you so much for having me, and
Thank you. It's been
have a good
pleasure.
day.
You too.